Good morning. Thank you for all who have joined so far. We're going to start promptly at 10 o'clock, so we'll give folks a minute or two to join. Please take the poll that's popped up on your screen, and again, we'll start at 10 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for those who have joined and for taking the poll. That's really helpful for us to kind of assess the audience and get to know the folks who have joined us and their familiarity with the LANDFIRE product. So thank you so much. My name is Kai Foster. I work for Conservation Biology Institute, and I am going to be running the logistics for the webinar this morning. So a few things before we get started. When you joined, you heard that you are in listen-only mode. We, however, do really encourage questions during this webinar. So what we'll do is we'll collect your questions throughout the webinar. You can put those questions in the question text box in your upper right-hand panel. You can type them there as you think of them. I will not interrupt the presenter unless it's a clarifying question. We'll hold all the questions till the very end. Alternatively, if you prefer to ask your question verbally, maybe it's an involved question, go ahead and use the hand raising function, which looks like just a little hand button that indicates to me that I need to go ahead and unmute your line so that you can ask your question. And of course, that would happen after the presentation. We do want to remind everybody that we record all of our webinars in this series, and you can always find the webinars at our website, consbio.org. Under products and publications, you can go to webinars and see past recorded webinars as well as the upcoming. So that's something to note. I will send out a URL that will point you to that record. So if you want to share with your colleagues or friends, or you want to hear the presentation again, you have that option. I'd also like to mention that there's going to be a short survey at the end of the presentation, so that will pop up on your computer when the webinar is closed. So please feel free to go ahead and fill out that survey. That'd be super helpful for the TNC LANDFIRE team. And then if you don't have time, you'll get a prompt via email to take that survey later if you don't have time. I also want to mention that Jeannie Patton from the TNC team is going to be putting URLs, links to important sites and locations of information in the chat box. So please go ahead and keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. You might see those links in the chat. So keep an eye out for that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the screen over, and I'm also going to begin the recording. So again, welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. We are so pleased to have our presenters, Jim Smith, who is the project lead for LANDFIRE and with TNC, as well as Corey Blankenship, a fire ecologist with the LANDFIRE team. And this morning they're going to be talking about the new LANDFIRE product, the Remap 2016, specifically for the Southwest US. So thank you so much to our presenters for joining this morning, and go ahead, Jim.
A test first, Kai. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. First, let me tell everyone what a privilege it is to be here with you, representing all the women and men who are working hard every day with the LANDFIRE program. Also want to thank Kai and the CBI, as well as Jeannie Patton of the LANDFIRE team for setting up this webinar. But importantly, I also thank you for taking an hour of your very precious time to participate in this discussion, and we hope that you find it useful. And we also hope that you will contact us with questions or issues that you may have down the road once you hear this, or if you have other things that you want to learn about. You'll find contact information at the end of the webinar. Corey, have you passed control to me? Yep, there we go. Okay. So first, the agenda for the webinar today. We're going to talk a little bit about the past, then talk about where we are, and then future plans. Then I will turn the webinar presentation over to Corey, who will talk about some of the impacts, the changes, the innovations that have taken place recently, as well as the BPS review. And then we'll also, again, talk about some of the support and resources that are available to the LANDFIRE user community. Pardon me. So who is LANDFIRE? Well, you may know or may not know that LANDFIRE is, at its core, a data creation program that is designed to create and periodically update vegetation, fire, and fuels characteristics across the nation. A lot of people are laboring behind the scenes to create these products. On the left, you'll see what is the core of the production team at the AROS Data Center. The USGS AROS Data Center. On the right, you will see the Nature Conservancy's LANDFIRE team. The folks at the USGS are primarily involved in the day-to-day production of the LANDFIRE products, along with a small group that's centered around Missoula, Montana. And the TNC LANDFIRE team, we participate in some parts of the production process, but we also work as user support team and sort of coordinating communications and outreach. LANDFIRE is a true partnership between USDA Forest Service Fire and Aviation Management Group and U.S. Department of the Interior Office of Wildland and Fire, the Nature Conservancy, and USGS AROS. And it is this interagency cooperation that has really made LANDFIRE successful. So let's talk a bit about the past, the LANDFIRE Foundation. The LANDFIRE program was initiated and is basically driven by a charter that was signed back in 2004. And while there are a lot of parts of this charter, I typically boil it down to what I call the 4 C's, that LANDFIRE will create comprehensive products. By comprehensive, we mean every acre in the United States, that is continental US, Alaska, Hawaii, and the island territories. The second C, compatible, means that all these products will match thematically and geometrically, which makes them easier to use when you first get them. You don't have to do any projection changes. You don't have to do any recoding or anything. They all match thematically and geometrically. Consistent is we use as much as possible consistent processes and data sets across space as well as time. And I'm going to come back to consistency in a moment. But that is important, that we try as much as possible to do the same thing on every acre in this entire area that we're interested in. And finally, the 4th C would be current. We are charged with keeping these products as current as possible given the other 3 C's. And it is important to understand that these design criteria have a real impact on what we can produce, when we can deliver it, and what its vintage is, how current is it. I wanted to speak just a moment about consistency because we're not able to be 100% consistent across space and across time. That means exactly the same. So we would try to use the same processes, we try to use the same basic data sets, but they are not the same in Alaska as they are in Florida, as they are in Maine or Hawaii, but we do everything we can to make things as consistent as possible to allow as useful a comparison across the nation as we can. And that would be the same for all the temporal versions as well. In the spirit of trying to improve the products and listen to user feedback, we have made changes to some processes and to some products in order to make them more useful to the community. So it is, while we try to be consistent, you might, if you start comparing different versions, you might need to look at the documentation. You might need to talk to the LANDFIRE program to really understand what has changed between versions so that it doesn't impact your comparisons. LANDFIRE has delivered several versions. The original version, circa 2000, 2001, which we call either LANDFIRE National or Improved. And then the product was updated in 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2014. Those were the dates that the data represents, not the dates that they were actually delivered. We're now engaged in Remap 2016. The important thing to know about Remap is that it is not, okay, it is not an update. Sorry, the slide is not advancing. Let me see if I can make that work. Corey, can you take back control and then I'll just ask you when to advance?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you go back one slide, please?
Yes.
Because for some reason it won't advance for me. Okay. That LANDFIRE is not a remap. LANDFIRE is not an update. It is actually a remap. So advance for me, Corey, please. All right, so just to give you an idea of what has been delivered in the past, this is previous versions of LANDFIRE. The rows represent 24 or so 30-meter spatial data layers, all grids, ARC grids, plus some models that were developed by the TNC team. And you can see that there are also multiple versions, as I mentioned, the original plus updates in 8, 10, 12, and 14, and we're now engaged in Remap. It was not my intent that you actually read this table, but that you understand what the past is like and what has been produced. All these different layers for all these different geographies 5 different times, and we're now engaged in the 6th, which we call Remap. Okay, Corey, next. So this is where we are in the Remap. And remember, Remap is not an update. It is an actual recreation of the majority of the product suite from scratch. Some layers we have not done, and we can talk about that later if somebody has a question. But you can think about any of the vegetation-related layers, the fuels-related layers, and ultimately the fire regime and condition layers. They will all be recreated from scratch, okay? New imagery, new plots, some new processes, et cetera, to create a fresh product rather than an update. The Northwest, the Southwest, and South Central have been delivered. We divide the country into the continental U.S. into 6 different geo areas. So 3 have been delivered, and again, it's the vegetation layers and the fuel layers that have been delivered, along with some of the terrain layers as well. So those are there and available for download on landfire.gov. At the end of the continental U.S. process, we will also create national mosaics that can also be downloaded from landfire.gov. But at this point, we cannot do that because we don't have a national completed layer yet. Fire regime and condition layers will be delivered once CONUS is complete. We will begin finishing up that production and deliver things like vegetation departure, like mean fire return interval, et cetera, will be delivered after CONUS is complete for the veg and fuels layers. Next, Corey. So let's talk about what has remained the same in the Remap. Same design criteria and constraints. We're still charged with being comprehensive, compatible, as consistent as possible and as current as possible. So that has not changed. The basic product suite is the same. You'll see minor differences from version to version, but the basic product suite has stayed the same. That is existing vegetation type, cover, and height, as well as the fuels layers, the fire behavior fuel model surface layers 13 and 40, and the canopy fuels, plus we will eventually deliver as many of the fire regime layers. So that is the same, but some processes have been changed, and I'm going to focus on that in a moment. Again, these processes have been changed to improve what we think is the product usability. However, still the same as LANDFIRE should be considered a large landscape, regional, national data set as delivered out of the box. If you wish to use it for small geographies, you can expect to need to review and perhaps do revisions that are necessary to make it more accurately reflect the conditions that you see on the ground where you are on small geographies. That has not changed, okay? Okay, Corey, next, please. So what is new? I've been mentioning new processes. I'm going to cover a few of them. I'm not going to go into great detail. If you have any questions about any of them, I'd be happy to answer them at the end of the webinar or in a follow-up conversation. So the original LANDFIRE products were based on National Land Cover Database map zones, which did give us some problems that we had to deal with. So in the remap, we changed our geographic framework to Omernic Level 3 ecoregions, which a little bit more ecologically relevant. So that helped us reduce some issues with seam lines, as well as to allow us to control the legend, the types that could appear more effectively than we could with NLCD map zones. Next, Corey. We utilized and developed new compositing, tiling, masking methods for the basic satellite imagery that's used to create these products, which helped us have a better image base on which to produce the products. And this is another reason why we were able to help reduce the impacts of seam lines, where in the past we might have seen where two map zones come together. You will find that less frequently and less evident in the remap. Next, Corey. We have new improved auto keys for assigning vegetation type to field plots. And this is really critical because we have hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million plots in the LANDFIRE reference database. And those plots have to be assigned some sort of category of vegetation type for us to use in the mapping process. And we use auto keys, sort of like an automated dichotomous key. And we had some issues with that in the first LANDFIRE, so we actually had a project to review those and improve those, so we have new and improved auto keys, which we think creates a better field plot database for us to use in the processes. Next, Corey. We have just more imagery. We have Landsat 8 now instead of just Landsat 5 and 7. With the scan line issues and other things that were in those older Landsat imagery, now we have quite an image stack, which includes Landsat 8 imagery, which has been very beneficial. Next. Importantly, before delivery, we now include an external review of the vegetation type legend and draft products before they're actually delivered to the public. And we use NatureServe for that, as well as some GAP personnel to actually review the products, identify issues that we could then go back and correct before public delivery. Next. A new product this time will be an independently mapped NVC group. There is a mandate to use the FGDC classification, the National Vegetation Classification, in projects. So we did add this as a new product, and it is independently mapped from plots and imagery rather than crosswalked from ecological systems as we did in the previous versions. Okay, next, Corey. What else is new? Well, we have many more field plots and, importantly, more diverse field plots to support the mapping. Good imagery-based mapping requires good field information to be successful. And after a number of years of negotiation, we were able to obtain natural resource inventory plots from the NRCS program, as well as the assessment, inventory, and monitoring plots from the BLM program, to help us fill in gaps in the plot database that we had really a lot of gaps in the shrub areas as well as in the Central Plains, the agricultural areas. So we had a lot more plots and a lot better geographic and thematic distribution of plots this time. Next. We were able to incorporate LIDAR where we could find it to improve the thematic resolution of structure products. And Corey is going to talk about that. She's going to show an example of the improved thematic resolution of the structure products due to the fact that we could use LIDAR. There was a lot more LIDAR available. We had tools and processes to use it. So that is a real improvement in this particular version of LANDFIRE. Next. We were also able to incorporate NLCD continuous shrub cover products. In this products and processes, they had a separate project where they really used very detailed techniques and imagery to try to improve the cover mapping for the shrub types, and LANDFIRE was able to integrate and incorporate that information. We also, during the intervening years, have conducted a review of all the biophysical settings, models, and descriptions, and we have a new suite of those that will be delivered at the end of CONUS when the fire regime products are delivered. This will be a set that has been updated for new research, that has been cleaned for errors, that has been improved in terms of overlap, and so we think that you'll find that this BPS suite to be a lot more effective than the original version. Next. Now here's some new products. You will find instead of it, we've always had disturbance products, but we have a new product called H disturbance, which actually incorporates 10 years of disturbance into one layer instead of just the previous last disturbance or what we consider to be the most important disturbance. So in our disturbance layers, there is an H-dist product which will contain 10 years of disturbance data. A new product that we call year-capable fuels is also going to be available to those of you who are interested in fuels. And what this does is instead of the fuels products all representing the year of the vintage of the remap, for instance, 2016, in disturbed areas, those fire behavior fuel model products, that is the surface and canopy fuels, have been moved ahead to the year of delivery. So we have actually transitioned fuel information in disturbed areas from 2016 to 2019 for those products that were delivered in 2019. So that would be Northwest, Southwest, North Central will all be year capable 2019 for those fuels products in disturbed areas alone. Next. And finally, the last thing I'll talk about here is a new backwardly compatible fire regime group schema. And Corey, you can go ahead and advance and I'll talk about it. So fire regime group has been an important sort of way to categorize the landscape in the past. We had a 5-category fire regime group, but we had this was not developed by LANDFIRE, but it was implemented by LANDFIRE and delivered nationally. And the user feedback was that this was not a particularly effective way to categorize the landscape. In particular, there was not enough thematic resolution in the fire return interval part of the fire regime group definition. So LANDFIRE did contract with Wendell Hand to go do an analysis of fire regime group, and we used that analysis as a guide to basically split up the 5 major fire regime groups, Roman numerals 1 through 5, and subdivide them into categories of mean fire return interval to give you a little bit more thematic resolution. So instead of fire regime group 1 being 0 to 35, it's now been divided into 0 to 5, 6 to 15, and 16 to 35. But notice that it's still backwardly compatible with previous products. Should you need to go back and compare, you could collapse and do that. Okay, so we hope that you find that this fire regime group schema is a little more effective than what was produced in the past. Next, Corey. So LANDFIRE Remap quality. So when we talk about spatial data quality or product quality, what we're really after is to try to understand the usability of that product. Is it useful to me for my application on my geography? And I would contend that there is no single answer to that question. So our approach is to provide you as much information about the product quality as we can, and then allow you to make the decisions about whether it's useful to you for what you're going to do, okay? So we are now able to basically provide near simultaneous delivery. We're hoping for simultaneously, but we've been a week or so off at times in the past, but hopefully near simultaneous delivery of the information that we have about the quality of the EVT products, NVC group, ecological systems, and then crosswalked NVC macro group and SAF SRM cover type. You'll find that on landfire.gov under the data quality section. You'll find this for each of the geo areas that has been delivered. So there are thousands of independent plots. In fact, for the Southwest geo area, we had 13,000 plots that we withheld from the mapping process that were then compared back to the product to say, our Autokey said it should have been this map there, LANDFIRE mapped this there. Sometimes it was right, sometimes it wasn't wrong. The cross-tabulation of those 13,000 plots result in a contingency table. That's the next slide, Corey. So we have provided a traditional contingency table for you to use. It has all the information, all the cross-tabulation of all the agreement assessment plots are there for you. But I will warn you that contingency table is 202 rows by 202 columns. And we don't have enough plots for all the different 202 types that were mapped. Some had few plots. If it had only a few plots, we did not withdraw any to do an agreement assessment because we wanted to use them in the mapping process. So there's not an even distribution of plots. This is not an ideal agreement assessment, but it's what we could do within the design constraints that we had. So to hopefully help you a little bit, go again, Corey, for me, please. I've created a category agreement table, which basically takes all the information in the contingency table and separates it by category. So you'll have a row in there for each category that will list its how many plots there were, what the agreement was, and importantly, what were the three primary mapping mistakes that were made for that category. So I think you'll find the category agreement table useful as you go to try to evaluate the product and see if it's useful for you. And we have one of those category agreement tables for NVC group, macro group, SAF, SRM, as well as ecological systems. So I hope that you'll find that useful. In addition, we've learned over the last few years that many people don't use the legend as we provide it. Sometimes they lump categories. So in order to help you assess your lumped category system, also included an example of how to collapse a contingency table to the category system that you're actually using. As long as your categories are lumped ones that we provide information on, you can lump you can basically collapse that contingency table to create a contingency table that relates to your classification. And finally, we are planning on an assessment of vegetation cover and height as soon as we can, and also sort of trying to understand how we might be able to assess surface fuel models. That's something that we would like to do that we have not yet done. So again, you'll find everything that we have on landfire.gov. And I hope you'll go there and look at those products as you evaluate the LANDFIRE product suite to see whether it's useful for you. Next slide, Corey. Okay, the future. Remap 2016 for the continental U.S. will wrap up early 2020 or so, the first half of 2020. And then we'll be turning our full attention to Alaska, Hawaii, and the island territories over the next year or so. And that would include, when I say summer of 2020, that would include the fire regime group products as well. So that is the near-term future of remap delivery. North Central will be delivered in the next month or so. Southeast geo area will be next, and then it will be Northeast. Because remapping is quite a bit more expensive than updating, we don't know if we'll be able to conduct another remap. It'd be nice to remap every few years to get new imagery, new plots, new everything all filtered into the system. But given the expense, we may not be able to do it. We're going to try to do it, but we may not be able to. So instead, next slide, Corey. So next, our goal is to try to find a way to provide more rapid current updates within a shorter time period. So can we deliver within a year rather than within 2 years or 3 years? That is something we'll be working on, trying to really speed up the process, provide as much information as we can very quickly, and then perhaps more information in stages as we move down the line. It's important that we try to make this data more current without giving up quality, and that is going to take some change in process. So I'm going to now turn it over to Corey. Caitlin, you ready?
Yes. How's my volume?
Sounds great.
Okay, good. All right, so Jim provided a lot of broad strokes for what you can expect with the remap data, and I am going to start here drilling down to some specific examples showing how those improvements or changes are going to look in the data products. I'm going to focus in the next few slides on improvements that have been made to existing veg. So that includes existing veg type, cover, as well as height. And the reason I'm focusing on existing veg is because that's the foundation of the LANDFIRE product suite. And those products, type, cover, and height, are used to map things like fuels and S-class. So their quality affects the quality of some of the downstream products. All right, so my first example here is of the seam line issue that Jim mentioned. Now we're processing imagery in a new way using tiling and larger processing units, and that leads to fewer seam lines. So what you see here in the top image is a stark change right at a map zone boundary in shrub cover. Now in remap with our new processes, you can see that that break in cover is not so evident at the map zone boundary. This next example is looking at how we've improved shrub cover mapping. The National Land Cover Database, or NLCD, now produces a continuous shrub cover product that Jim mentioned. It's based on very high resolution imagery, and LANDFIRE has incorporated that into its remap process. So here you can see an area in 2014. I'm going to see if I can grab a little pen here. So you see this area in the center image mapped as herbaceous cover in 2014, and in remap, we've captured it as shrub, which matches how it was identified in the NLCD data. So in arid areas, like this one, we're doing a better job of identifying low shrub cover using our new methods. Okay, it just takes me a minute to get off of the drawing tools, normal, non-drawing mode. Okay, there we go. Whoops, great. Another improvement is that in previous LANDFIRE versions, natural existing vegetation types were mapped regardless of disturbance history. We've changed that in remap to more accurately reflect the vegetation on the ground following disturbance. So in this example, starting on the right, you see an area in a tan color mapped as shrub by NLCD. That's actually an old burn scar. In 2014, in the middle of the screen, you see that we mapped that area as California montane, woodland, and chaparral, which is its quote unquote natural existing vegetation type. But in Remap on the left, we've now incorporated disturbance data, and we know that this area was recently burned. And so we're classifying it as recently burned shrub cover, which more accurately represents what's on the ground there today. In previous LANDFIRE versions, we had what we called aggregate types. So for your barren types and riparian and wetland types, we had these coarse categories. As an example, on the right here, you see in 2014, we mapped the North American warm desert, riparian, forest, and woodland. And you see on the left in Remap, that one type is split out into 3 different types. You're going to see a similar change in the barren types. So in the Remap legend, where you previously would have just had barren, this sort of broad generic category, you're now going to get some finer level distinctions, such as bedrock and scree or playa. So you get more information about what's on the ground. As part of Remap, we've also tried to improve the mapping of individual existing vegetation types. Here, I'm showing an example of how we've tried to improve the mapping of greasewood flat. In 2014, shown in the middle, you can see a broad distribution of this type, including mapping it on higher slope positions where other shrub types are probably more appropriate. In Remap, on the left, you can see that it's now been restricted to lower slope locations. Now, importantly for our focus today here on the Southwest, we've made an effort to improve the mapping of invasive species such as cheatgrass. So here what you're seeing is on the left our Remap product, and in the center our 2014 product, compared to, on the right, the near real-time annual herbaceous cover product. So using that near real-time annual herbaceous product as kind of the standard, you can see that in Remap, we've more closely captured the distribution of invasive annual grasslands. LANDFIRE is now mapping continuous height and cover. What you're seeing here on the screen is an example of what these new legends are going to look like. They're so long that I can't actually show them all and have you be able to read the individual classes. So these are partial examples. And you can see the level of detail that you're going to get in these new products. Previously, we binned data into broader classes. So for example, herb cover would have been binned into 10% breaks, and height for trees, I think we had 5 classes that we mapped height into. So you can see you're going to get a lot more detail in the height and cover products. Here's what this looks like in the actual data. I'm showing the existing vegetation height. On the left, how we mapped it in 2014. And here you're seeing 2 dominant shades of green representing 2 height classes. And then on the right, you can see many shades of green showing this more fine-scaled variation that you get in the continuous height legend. You're seeing a similar pattern in the brown tones on these maps, which represent the shrub cover. In addition to updating our spatial products, for Remap, we're also going to deliver an updated and improved set of biophysical settings models. The biophysical settings models are a non-spatial product, and they're used in LANDFIRE to estimate reference conditions for mapping vegetation condition class, as well as the fire regime products. Back in 2015, we initiated a review of these models, and our primary goal was to update them and improve them with new science. However, along the way, we also completed the succession class mapping rules for each biophysical setting, and this plays a critical role in our ability to map succession class and then calculate vegetation condition class. We'll have new and improved description documents as well as a user-friendly data access website. One element of this biophysical settings review was a special effort to get review on widespread rangeland types in the West. We called these macro reviews, and what we did is we looked at the logical consistency between models for these 4 widespread types. So for example, the Intermountain Basin's big sagebrush shrubland, which you can see in this map in the brown tones, the darker tan color, we mapped on the biophysical settings map across nearly 52 million acres, and we created 12 unique models to represent that system throughout its range. We felt like it was important in the review to look at all these models as a set. So we took those 12 models and we asked questions like, with these 12 models, did we encompass the full range of variability across the range of the type? Did we accurately reflect ecological differences across the range? And are the models logically consistent? For example, does the fire return interval and fire severity change as we would expect across space? So to give you a flavor for the types of changes you'll see in the models, I'm going to drill down into one example. Again, I've taken the Intermountain Basin's big sagebrush shrubland and just looking at the model that represents the area shown on your screen here. This is the Great Basin, sort of Great Basin Plus model. This model was reviewed by a group of Nature Conservancy scientists, and they indicated that the original model encompassed a lot of variability and would probably be more useful to managers if we divided it into 2 types. They suggested an upland type and a semi-desert type. So based on their feedback, we defined these 2 types. We have an upland soils model now, which is for areas that receive greater than 10%, or excuse me, 10 inches of precip annually and can support pinyon and juniper trees. And then we also have a semi-desert type that's found in areas with less precipitation. It can't support trees and it has a different fire regime. So we refine the models and the descriptions to reflect the differences in indicator species and fire frequencies. When the models are delivered, you'll have access to this new searchable and user-friendly interface for downloading the model information. Right now, the models for the conterminous US and Hawaii are complete, and as Jim mentioned, they'll be publicly available when the spatial products that accompany them are made available. The models for Alaska are still being finalized because we have some changes in the legend in that area. As part of these webinars, we always like to highlight how LANDFIRE data are used. Of course, we're not just creating data to create data. We want to see it applied in useful ways. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rio Grande Water Fund, which is an effort in New Mexico to protect municipal water supplies. This is work done by the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico and its partners. And they developed a plan to describe current wildfire threat to water sources and forested watersheds, and then they prioritize areas where treatments will help reduce wildfire impacts. LANDFIRE spatial data were a key part of this effort, providing ready-to-go and current data for the entire state. So LANDFIRE data were used in a couple of different places in this analysis, but one really important aspect was the use of the LANDFIRE fuels data in the wildfire risk assessment. They used the FLAM map model along with the LANDFIRE surface and canopy fuel layers to look at fire behavior across the landscape. That wildfire risk was one component that feeds into the focal areas analysis, which you see mapped here, the focal areas that are used to identify where water supplies are at risk. So on this map, what you're seeing in those red tones are areas that are in need of restoration treatment to protect water supplies. And then in the green tones are areas that have a lower need for treatment. The focal areas map can be used to ensure that the water funds are allocated to areas where the risk to the water supplies is greatest and where the restoration actions could have the highest probability of success. So again, this is just one example of how LANDFIRE data are being used. To wrap it up here, I'm going to go back to what Jim said at the beginning about the 4 C's. LANDFIRE data are comprehensive, compatible, consistent, and current. And this is part of what makes the data so useful. But we encourage users to remember that they're really designed for regional and national level applications. And if you want to use them at finer scales, we encourage you to review them and modify them for local use. There are a number of resources on the LANDFIRE website to help do that. With LANDFIRE Remap, you hopefully have heard today that we've got a whole lot of new processes that we're using to improve the usability of these data sets, and they're going to represent a circa 2016 landscape condition. Users can have a big impact on LANDFIRE products. You can provide plots and data that will help us do a better job of identifying what's in our imagery and the classifications that come out of that and into our mapped products. And you can also provide feedback. If you use LANDFIRE data and have suggestions for improvement, you can contact us either via the help desk or there's a contact us spot on the website. Feel free to contact either Jim or I with questions. And you can find us online. Of course, landfire.gov is sort of the mother website. There's also a lot of good information about how to use the data, guides for updating and reviewing, as well as user applications on the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Gateway LANDFIRE site. We're on Twitter and YouTube, and we have a postcard that you can opt into if you want to receive updates and information on what's going on with the program. So thanks so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate your time and interest. And it looks like we've got about 15 minutes, and we'd be happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Corey and Jim. Yeah, we do have a couple questions that have come in during the presentation, but I do want to encourage audience members to continue to type in your questions. This first one's more of a sort of a compliment or a comment on the Autokey, making that publicly available from Patrick Alexander. He's really happy that that Autokey is available for folks to kind of dig in a little bit more about how plant communities were separated. He was in the past having a little bit of a challenge with just the descriptions of those, so that's really a helpful thing. So that's great. This is a question, actually, there's sort of two folks who are sort of asking questions about some of the revisions of the EVT, specifically with the near real-time data, as well as the continuous shrub cover, about how users can utilize previous versions of the LANDFIRE product that don't have those revisions to either go back or somehow modify what they're seeing in previous versions, if that's possible.
I don't think, well, I'm going to answer as best I can. They're still comparable, but some of the differences that you would see would be due to change in process, and it would be hard to separate that out. The continuous shrub cover, if it's say, let's just say substantially different than what we had in the past, say a LANDFIRE said it was 20% and continuous shrub cover, the current product, the current LANDFIRE product says it's 50%. Well, I probably would question the original LANDFIRE value anyway. There shouldn't be that substantial a difference between two different products like that. I don't think there should be anyway. So you can compare them, but when you get big differences, you would probably have to question one or the other, unless there's been a disturbance like a fire or somebody's done some sort of mechanical treatment or something else has happened. I would expect them still to be comparable. If they're not comparable, I would question one or the other of the values.
Great. So if folks are, considering something like a real-time year-to-year change, how are they able to differentiate a year-to-year change versus sort of a data source or process change?
Well, there's not really a good way to do that. And of course, we're talking about 2 years. We would have to look and see what kind of change you might expect ecologically over a 2-year period. Say if you're comparing 14 to 16, which would be the big change, right? From an update that didn't use continuous shrub cover to 2016, which is a remap, which did use continuous shrub cover. Then, when you compare those two, does the difference make sense or not? If it goes up by 50%, it's the same answer. I don't think it's a valid comparison. There is no way to separate it out, what was due to process versus what was due to an actual change in the landscape, unless you have other information that's available to you. So I would say that, compare them, but be cautious in those comparisons when you see a big difference. That would be a red flag to me, unless, again, there's been some reason to expect a difference. So I don't know of any method to split out, let's just say, process impacts versus landscape impacts. I don't know of one.
Okay. And a quick, just to go back to the Autokey topic, I believe is the Autokey process that you went through, I've seen it on the website. Is it available for users to view?
I believe it is. I have not downloaded it myself, but I believe it is. And what I'll do is I'll check, and then I can send an email to you, Kai, and you could distribute it to whoever asks the question, okay?
Okay.
I have not done that, but I presume that it is, and I'll have to look.
I believe I've seen it before, but I could be wrong. So
okay.
We'll get back to you, Patrick.
I'll verify that. Okay.
Okay. Great. So another question about how can LANDFIRE Remap NVC products be crosswalked with Remap EVT products? And how can the Remap NVC product be crosswalked with previous versions of the EVT?
Okay, so when we say EVT, that includes both ecological systems, our original classification, as well as now NVC group, right? So when I say EVT, I'm including both. So I'm presuming they're asking about crosswalking ecological systems to NVC group. Is that what I'm hearing, Kai? I didn't quite understand.
I just read it as
if she means EVT is ecological systems.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if Ben will give us a clarification on that one.
yeah, because I'm a little confused about the crosswalking. We did crosswalk in the past up into this version. Anything you saw that was not ecological systems would have been a crosswalk.
Okay.
Now we have two independent products, ecological systems and NVC. NVC group is collapsed to form NVC macro group. That's just a part of the hierarchy. Ecological systems is still crosswalked to SAF SRM cover type. Okay, but we have new ecological systems products. So the comparisons over time should mostly be due to landscape change, but there could be changes in process where we think we're mapping Corey's example, greasewood flat better now.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the change you see in greasewood flat in 2016 remap could be due to us doing a better job than we did in the past. That's why comparison across time can sometimes be complicated.
Jim, I'll just add that if you download our ecological systems existing vegetation type product, in the attribute table, you'll see additional attributes that include the ecological system, first of all, because that's the primary attribute that's being mapped, but also the SAF, Society of American Foresters, or SRM, Society of Range Management crosswalk, and some of the NBC levels in there as well.
Yeah, and there are other attributes in there as well that might be of interest to you.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry I couldn't answer that question better, but I'm a little confused by it. So maybe we need to follow up with that individual after the call.
Sure, Ben, we can do that with you if you need more detail there. Ben did also have a question about since the remap is for the western part of the U.S. and you're working towards the east, for folks who maybe want to combine the remap in the west and maybe the current conterminous U.S. product, is that a compatible process? And specifically, they're asking about a GIS process, if the mosaic is the best way to do that.
I don't know, Corey might be able to answer that better than I, but you should still be able to combine them. It would just be incomplete. They should all match geometrically.
Yeah, so I think where you'd run into problems and you'd have to decide whether this matters or not for your analysis, but you'd have two different vintages of data. So if you used remap in the west, you're going to have a circa 2016 product. And then in the east, if you used our most recent product, that would be circa 2014. So you'd need to be aware that you're using two different vintages of data. And then you'll notice changes in the legend. So I gave some examples. You'll move from bin data in 2014 to continuous height and cover data, which you could easily re-bin the remap data into the same classes as the 2014 product. But then you'll also, in the existing vegetation type legend, there are going to be differences that I don't think are irreconcilable, but would probably take a little bit of work. So maybe you'd take the remap data and re-bin the aggregates, like I showed with riparian and barren types. And then you're not going to see in 2014 any of the recently burned categories. So I think it depends on what you're doing, and you'd have to sort of pay attention to some of these fine level details, but technically it's definitely possible. And then I think you just have to decide how to appropriately interpret your results given some of the differences in the data sets.
Great. Yeah, that recently burned category is, for me, I've been using LANDFIRE, and that's one of the things that I am very excited about being able to see.
Yeah, we found it useful in the last year. I've been working with the Salmon Chalice National Forest. They're going through forest plan revision right now. And that was a really important class for them because so much of the forest has burned recently.
Yeah, it's really valuable. So it looks like we are out of questions that have been typed in. So if we want to go ahead and maybe do some closing comments, and if anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to type those in.
Well, just for me, thanks again to everyone who participated, Jeannie and Kai for setting it up, Corey for being a part of the presentation. We really appreciate your attention, and again, encourage you at any point to contact us using any method you wish. We will try to help you understand and utilize the products appropriately.
Awesome, and thank you again, Jim and Corey, for the great presentation, and Jeannie for helping direct the audience via all the URLs and important information in the chat. And it's been a real pleasure to have you join us today. And again, thank you for taking the time, both presenters and audience. Do look for the survey at the end of this webinar, as well as emails, including the link to the recording. And I think with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. It looks like we have no more questions coming in. So again, thank you so much. And I hope to have folks join us for future webinars. And thank you again, presenters.
Thanks, Kai.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.